Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have photographer Cig Harvey as tonight's guest speaker. Cig received her MFA from Rockport College and went on to teach for 8 years as assistant professor at Lesley University. Her photographs and artist books have been widely exhibited and are included in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Farnsworth Art Museum, and the George Eastman House, New York. Cig was recently nominated for the John Goodman Fellowship and was a finalist for the BMW Prize at Paris Photo, as well as a finalist for the Prix Virginia. In 2012, she had a solo show at the Stenersen Museum in Norway in conjunction with the release of her monograph, You Look at Me Like an Emergency, from Schilt Publishing. Her second book, Gardening at Night, will be released in the spring of 2015, also from Schilt. Cig's devotion to visual storytelling has led to international campaigns and features with New York Magazine, Harper's Bazaar Japan, Kate Spade, and Bloomingdale's. On a personal note, I want to say, Cig, thank you for being here tonight. You braved an unseasonably heavy snowstorm in Maine, early November. Unbelievable, but thank you for being here. So please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you for coming. I'm so honored to be invited. I always have to sort of pinch myself that this is actually my job. And I always get a little nervous before events like this because I just want to do a good job. I feel like we all picked the best medium, the most powerful medium in the world. And somehow I'm lucky enough to stand here right now. And so I just want to share with you just more about my process and how much I love this medium and what it's brought to my life. So I'm going to talk less about the pictures itself and more about my process, why I make, how I make. But I really want to extend a huge thank you to SVA. It's my first time here, and I always wanted to go to school here, so maybe I'll come back and do another master's. Okay, so
we have an online program too.
Oh, I like the surveillance thing. Maybe that's where I'm going to go. So that we're a wonderful group here. I'm completely wide open book in a lecture series like this. So ask me anything. I'll tell you everything. It's great to see some past students in the crowd. I know I got a couple of you there I can always smile at. So my journey with photography began when I was 13. I used to make tons of tea in a darkroom in the southwest of England. And my passion was documentary photography. I loved it. And when I was 16, I went to South America on my own and I photographed the street kids of Potosi. And I came back armed with lots of mediocre film and nothing got published. And the weight of that caused me to stop making pictures for a while. I knew that I loved photography, but I couldn't find my way in it. And it took me really until 1999 when I came to a school situation like this, and I sat in the front row, and I was first in and I was last out, and I was like, that's it. I finally found my voice and how to speak through photography, and it was because I started making pictures about things rather than of things. And that, for me, is sort of the biggest thing I want to share. Like, the lecture's done now, we can all go home. This idea that photography is storytelling about a subject matter. Before that, I had come from the school of, yeah, but, and the school, oh, that's pretty, oh, look at that. It was like my photography was sort of target practice. And I was responding to just things in front of me. And the idea that it could not be that way, and I could sort of dig deep and tell things about the past, about my own experience, was an extraordinary revelation for me. And so I started telling my own stories rather than other people's. And I do think one day I'll go back to Potosi and make better pictures of those street kids and get that work published. I feel that's my duty, but right now I'm telling a more sort of simpler, localer story. So I moved to Maine, and I was torn between a couple of different programs. I was living in Bermuda in '99, and I was working for a platinum printer, and I was running his studio. His name's Mark Emerson. He was a wonderful guy, and he was sort of at the stage where he was about to retire. So my internship, studio managing, involved 3-hour-long lunches where he would sort of philosophize about the world, and I have so much love for him in my heart. It was great. It was a great time, and we talked about the power of pictures. And I moved to Maine, and I decided that instead of sort of running around like the headless chicken around the world, I would force myself to make pictures in one room for a year. And pretty much that's what I did. And what I would work in these long accordion journals, and I have a few examples with me tonight, where I would sort of brainstorm and think, okay, so this is pictures about things. I'm going to make work about what I think I'm going through. So I would sit down and I would write metaphors and symbols and as many different content things I could think of. Nouns. Photography is so tied to things, right? What we put our cameras in front of. And then also content. I mean, I truly believe that for a photograph to be strong, it needs to have both form, so light and the formal concerns, framing, camera, coming together with content, the story. So for a strong photograph, we have form and content coming together. So I would brainstorm all these different ideas. I would put it all in these accordion journals. And it was really just a place to begin. So that when Saturday morning came around, I would put the coffee on and I would get to work. I would say, okay, I'm trying to talk about my past. I'm going to start with a flower as a metaphor for myself. I'm going to talk about, it being closed, a closed soul where I had nothing to give. I'm going to talk about this sterile environment, but that door behind it being slightly ajar. So these pictures were highly sort of orchestrated. What I was trying to tell at the time, I thought these pictures so much were about nostalgia. I thought they were about my past, but what I really see now in retrospect, that they were everything to do with fantasy. I started making this work when I had been living with a guy for 8 years, and the last 2 of them he was also living with someone else, unbeknownst to me. And so when I moved to Maine, I used photography as a way to start talking about ownership back of my house. And so this idea that the house would come to me. And, and this idea that I had also been always from the school of yeah, but I couldn't, I couldn't get back further enough. Oh, yeah, but, he needed to leave. Yeah, but it was raining. Yeah, but my camera broke. And so this idea of sort of taking full responsibility for everything in the frame and for slowly starting with a blank palette, sort of thinking myself more as a painter and adding the content in was a really good way for me to work. It's not the way I work now, but it's how I worked in '99. And also this idea of this sort of solitary making. It was exactly what I needed. It was my way of repairing. I literally, for a year, all I did was eat, sleep, and breathe photography. I slept amongst books. I woke up. I didn't go out once. I'd gone from being a very social person, I like to laugh, to someone who was just really inward and just making these pictures. So this picture is about being on the edge, being close. It's about scale. It's about significance. This was about my bitten down nails and hope. And initially when I started making this work, I was sort of using subject matter that was classically beautiful, like vessels and beds. And then what I started to do was to try and sort of poke myself. I always ask myself, am I making brave art? Typically the answer is no, but I'm trying. And I started adding objects into the pictures that had meaning to me. So this was the last time, I wore this dress the last time I saw him, and I ruined it at 3 a.m. by dropping cheeseburger down it. And it was a very expensive dress. And it, for me, became this symbol of this idea of the way I didn't want to be again. So I started putting clues into my pictures, and this asking yourselves, I think everyone in here is a maker, I imagine, and asking yourselves, who are your images for? Who are they made for? If someone had asked me at this time, I would have said, well, myself. But really, I was making work for someone who would never, ever see it. And that's what this picture was about. And I would brainstorm in these books again and writing down my dreams and ideas. I would search out landscapes that that looked how I felt inside. I would fill up rooms full of leaves, talking about living in an underworld, which is how it felt at that time. So literally I lived in Maine, so good job I lived in Maine rather than New York. And I think I filled those enormous trash bags, 10 of them, up, and a room this size, and it literally was waist height with leaves. The picture that I ended up liking was this one, where there are like 3 in my hair, and it took me, I think, a year later I was having classes in that room and I'd still see leaves, over by where Katrina's. And, so the point being, all this planning, all this foresight, all this sort of idea mapping was really just so I had a place to start. So that, have anyone ever been like, oh, you've got a few hours, you can go out and make your pictures, like mine's a blank, right? Oh, don't know where to begin, just wander around the world, see if something happens. So this was my way of sort of it beginning, but if I only made the pictures that I planned in my books, it felt completely contrived, and I hadn't let the magic of making happen. So there really is something about this idea that this, having these leaves was a place to start, but the moment I pick up the camera, I'm trying to forget everything that I've brainstormed and just see what would happen, see what comes out. This was about being tethered to my past, not tied. The rock was him. And I started using photographs from previous series, again, as this sort of reminder of things moving on, of things changing. This sort of strange, the way the camera sees is so different from our eyes, and I'll talk about that a few times, but this strange man hand. My ode to E.J. Bullock, who was photographing prostitutes at the turn of the century. And I would sit in history lessons often thinking, oh, I don't feel an affinity with this person. And then sure enough, within 6 months, never say never in photography, I was making work that somehow referenced it. In England, we have this old wives' tale that the peel of an apple will spell the initial of the person that you're meant to be with. And so as you're seeing this work, it's getting darker and darker, and actually the slides sort of pop a little bit. But it started off white on white, through to grey on grey, through to dark grey on grey, through to black on black. And I realized that I was sort of using the zone system in a way, using form to tell a story. It was like the language. That's what I was trying to do. And as the story, I told the story backwards. I dealt with sort of the sort of finding identity and self first with the white on white, through to the black on black that actually dealt with the betrayal. And I read Robert Adams' Beauty in Photography, and if you haven't read that book, buy it right now on Amazon or go to the local bookstore. It's such an extraordinary book for everyone. It's so well written and easy zip through read, but just a wonderful challenge of what your pictures can be. And this idea that landscape photography is a mirror of what's going on inside of you. Until that day, I had no idea. It blew my mind that I could go and find somewhere out there that was an absolute reflection for what I was feeling inside. So I sought out a landscape that felt dark, that felt knotted, that felt somehow like my stomach. And these pictures were shown at Choate Rosemary Hall, and they were shown on a 110-foot curved wall, and they really went from white on white and hung an inch apart, and they really went from white on white through to black on black. And and I realize now with that white on white work, in my critiques, in my graduate critiques at the time, they would say, oh, you're the Martha Stewart, and I found it sort of so strange and insulting, because really the idea that my pictures were so clean, when the reality of my life was sort of the opposite. So behind the camera was disaster. Like all of this crap, just, piled up books and clothes and overflowing ashtrays and, just like not good life, endless coffee pots. And in front was this amazing white space. And I realized it had nothing to do with autobiography or reality, and it had everything to do with fantasy. My own life was like a disaster, so photography became this amazing place for me to escape to. And I see this again and again with a lot of my students that, not always, and everyone's different. Every photographer, each one of you has a different story. But this idea that photography is either a mirror of what's going on in your life, what you're drawn to, what you're concerned with, or a balance. And for me, it's always been a balance. Now that I'm much happier, my work is much darker. The time when things were tough, photography was an escape route. And I went down, I was in that escape route, and it just so many times I cannot say how photography has sort of saved me again and again. This act, it almost doesn't matter. It's really nice that we have prints, but it almost doesn't matter. It's the act of the making that is this extraordinary gift that it brings to our lives. That's what I feel like. So this was a picture about sort of moving on. And I knew that I wanted to use a book as a symbol. And so, but I love books. And Tara, a book student in the class, I teach a bookbinding class. And I love books, and I couldn't have the heart to throw a book in. So my dad had come to stay, and this was a John Grisham. That's a slight secret. So I didn't have the chance to throw in one of mine, so I tucked in one of his many times over. And this is what I did with his words. I made a web of the crumbs that I was given. And I wanted to make a picture about him, with him in it, but I obviously wasn't talking to him at the time. So I used Mozart as a surrogate. And this idea that our pictures can have surrogates, that we might not have, a pony or a swimming pool, but sometimes when we're asked to push ourselves and get more creative with our subject matter, I feel like the pictures can somehow jump, and that somehow people realize that there's something authentic happens when you have to sort of work harder. It's almost like, I have a 3-year-old now, and I think sometimes when she has to be more imaginative, it's better for everyone. So when I made this work, I've sort of brought it to a close with an artist book. I made an edition of 17 copies, which if any of you 24 images in each, any of you that are bookbinders out there, that's a real labor of love, and it was sort of soup to nuts, sticking and burnishing and printing. So it was Maine, and it was, I think, January 2002, and there was no heat in the darkroom. It was January 2nd I began. And it had a ceiling kind of like this, drop ceiling. And so I threw 3 hair dryers over the drop part, and that was my heat. And I had them going on all day from 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning through to 6 p.m. That was my heat. And I was either listening, when I was printing this work, I was either listening to Sarah McLachlan or Meatloaf, crying or mad. And then I was just like, enough. It took me 45 days to print out the entire book every single day. And it was the most extraordinary thing to, like, each day make something good out of something bad, make something beautiful out of something I didn't understand. And then to sing at the same time doing it I recommend it all to everyone. And then I was done, and I made this. This is from a series called Eyes Like Disappointed Lemons. And in a way, it's tied to that black and white work, in terms of subject matter, content, but different formally. What I was trying to do here, because of the color, and I have never taken a color class, I never studied color theory, I just love color, and we see in color. And I just sort of exploded into it and never made a black and white image since, but I will again, never say never. And what I was trying to do here was sort of explore these ideas of everything I thought I would have gotten over. And I started, and I challenge you all tonight to rush out. This is called the daydream. I started to put secrets in my pictures. And I started to use color to shroud so I would pick a really dark secret, but I would shroud it in such a way formally that people were like, oh, that matches my couch. And so it became this sort of thing for me to start to do, like, how dark could I go with some of these secrets? Something happens when you have to love your own work, and you have to be in this game of photography for a lifetime to do anything more than scratch the surface, I feel. And and for me, adding these sort of secrets in, it was this way for me to, like, stay engaged in the process in a way that sort of surprised me. So I made this picture when I was living with that guy. I had sleep apnea. So every night, well, not every night, it would sort of go 3 days on, a week off, 2 days on, a month off. But regularly, I had sleep apnea. And the only way that I could sort of kick-charge me back was either by getting air or drinking water. And I literally would sort of crawl to the bathroom, and I made this picture to sort of remember that. And I made it because I wanted to remember somewhere that I never wanted to be again. So in a way, it's exactly the same as why my grandmother makes pictures, right? We make pictures as a society to remember. We make pictures to remember good times, typically. We make pictures to remember Christmas and christenings and whatever it is that, most people get a camera out for. Well, I choose to remember times that I don't quite understand, or times that I don't want to be in again, or times of great joy too, but using photography as this sort of witness, as evidence, that's what I'm interested in. And here I'm photographing, it's the same as if I had my friend Cornelius with me. I painted this whale, his family were whalers, and I painted this picture to remember this time that was very hard for him, and me helping him through this time. This was called the prom dress. And I used myself, I should have mentioned, I used myself at this time and for a period. I haven't made a self-portrait since 2007, but I worked initially because I was working. I had no money. I was definitely at that stage in my life where the bank would charge me for a $2 coffee, would charge me $37 because I'd gone overdrawn. And so I had no money to pay for models. But also I liked the solitude of it. I liked being able to take all day to make one picture. My sets are really slow, even when I work commercially, and I do work commercially. But I am going to talk more about my personal work tonight, because every commercial job I've gotten, and I've gotten some yummy ones, always been from my personal work. And every commercial job I've gotten, I've also always done this brainstorming mind map, and that's what sort of gotten me the job. So the self-portraits was more just this way of just being able to sort of take 12 hours to make a picture. For me, I did hide my face. I think I was trying to do that at the time to just make it universal. I don't think you need to hide faces to make something universal. I think that's what my later work is trying to deal with. But that was the device I used at the time, because faces are so specific to that person. This is Self-Portrait as Mary. Then I moved into this series, which was called The Impossible Tasks. I've always believed if you're a good person and you work really hard, that good things will happen to you. It's a sort of simple, nice philosophy to have, I think. And during this time, I was up against something that was not the case, and I didn't have the tools at hand to deal with it. So instead of sort of falling apart and drinking lots of wine and, doing whatever, we do in self-destruct mode, I made pictures. And it became this sort of, again, photography, this place to go to that made sense, that somehow, was making order out of chaos, beauty out of pain. I think of photography as this bucket, right? And it's this bucket where we can pour in. It's a beautiful bucket. We can pour in all of our ideas, our hopes, our fears, our concerns, our stereotypes. And somehow, all of the confusion and the chaos of being what it is to be human, we can then somehow get a 2D picture that somehow expresses that. And I think that's a pretty extraordinary way to live. This idea that as a photographer, you're a seeker. But photography cameras are just expensive pencils. So what do you have to say? Art is a form of communication. So you need to, figure out what it is you're saying with these cameras, with these pencils, and use it as a way, what are you concerned with in the world? And that doesn't necessarily mean concerned in the greatest sense, but what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about? How can you put that into your pictures? And that might be that you make a self-portrait project, or it might be that you go out and you head to West Africa right now. But finding that connection to what it is that you love, what makes you different from you, finding out what that is, I think is so important. So again, I would try and put humor into pictures, but it was all about sort of this feeling of being inadequate. And people often ask, how I made this one, and there's a few. My dad helped me with this one, full disclosure. He was a terrible assistant, kept cleaning his boat in between. Shortly fired here and after, but I am grateful that he helped me make this. But this is how I felt. I felt like completely just sort of dropped from the world. And then that, I often find that my portfolios typically take about a year. I work really hard. I try and I'm really into the sort of discipline of photography. I try and if I don't make a picture every day, I try and sort of at least do something towards a project every day. And typically they feel like they sort of run its course and then the next thing starts to happen. I don't believe that we pick our projects. I feel like if you work hard and you take lots of pictures, they come roaring out of you, So this series sort of moved into this where I always felt like I was too late for the event or too early. And I started sort of, slowly the camera started pulling back, including more people, and it was just this feeling of sort of not quite having sort of found my place in the world. I think sometimes I think of photography as in the act of picture making as like going to the gym. Sometimes, like you don't always want to go, but you're always glad that you went. I've never known a medium that gives so much back if you give it. This idea that it's such a what have you done for me lately kind of gig, right? If you haven't made a picture in a while, the battery runs out and your card doesn't work. When you in the darkroom, you sort of bump your head, and but once you start giving, it gives so much back. It is the sort of Romeo and Juliet. You turn up for those dates, it will always be there. And I'm so grateful that I have it as this sort of constant in my life. So. Clearly, I'm a romantic. I'm not a realist, and I wear that hat proudly. Sometimes that's been a cross I've had to bear. But again, I don't pick how my pictures look. I just make as much as possible, and that's for the sort of some days you're in, other days you're out, and you just have to make your work and be in love with the reasons behind it. The questions behind it. We always say that you want your pictures to ask questions, right? Postcards tell the answers, and photographs and art can they ask the questions. And this is a wonderful love letter to photography. I made this, and at the time, this cave was completely black. Couldn't see anything. You're bumping into things. Very long exposure, working in film all the way through here, and it was completely black. And then when I got the film back, I couldn't believe it. There, staring into the depth of this black water, and look what was there. What a wonderful metaphor of how a medium, can give you so much more, that the camera does not see the same way that our eyes see. It sees so much more. And again, it just reminds you that the world can be amazing, and you just need a camera there to record it. I use one camera, one lens. I'm not a tech head. I spoke at PPE last week, and it was like talking to the wrong crowd about that. But I'm not a tech head. I'm very rough on my equipment. I want good optics. I spend money on cameras, but if I break them in the line of duty, that's okay. People say, well, what camera should I use? Well, the one that excites you. Cameras are no use to us if they're sitting on your shelf. It doesn't matter what it is. Cameras don't make the pictures. Your heart and your gut do. That's the hard part. Making a good photograph is hard. And as soon as you realize that, there's this like freedom. You're like Braveheart moment of running down the street naked, right? Because once you realize that you're going to love your work, you're going to hate your work. You're going to love your work, you're going to hate your work. And that will never change, because that's the creative process. It helps a little bit when you hate your work. When you're in the trough, the answer is, you got to make more pictures. It's the last thing you want to hear. But when you go out and you do it, it gives you something back. So, I think that creative process is so challenging for all of us, and it never changes. And that's such a great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you've been making pictures for a week or 70 years. It's hard. But that's good, because it keeps everyone else from making great pictures all the time too. Right? So. Oftentimes I'll have some anecdotes here that I'll have people help me on the set. And there's actually two of my best mates hiding under this boat, holding it in place. I don't hire them, they're just friends. We drink some wine afterwards and have some fun. Just picture making that, just as a way of life, really. This is one of the last photographs last self-portraits that I have made, and I made it the day that I moved into my house, into a house with my husband. This is in 2005, and this picture was made in 2007, but a big shift happened in 2005 on in my work. I got happy. And I stopped making pictures about the past and past experiences and sort of brainstorming and thinking about, well, how, our job, right, as all photographers, whether you're a street or you're a constructor, is to make the unseen seen. That's our job. So, what is unvisual, make it visual. So I would, this idea of constructing from the past, and then I was like, I didn't want to do that anymore. I was happy, there was a life being lived, and I was in it. And so what I decided to do was just have a camera with me and record what was in front of me. I didn't need to construct, I didn't need to think about how best to tell that story. I just had to always make pictures every day. So I made this picture on the day we took over the house. We signed. My husband and I neither of us had ever bought a house before. And this was an extraordinary thing. We had a key-shaped key. It looked like a key closing, and we went, and he just sort of wandered around for hours. He has a way of doing this where he'll stare at the barn like it's a movie. And I got to work and made pictures. And this was about all the hope that I had for this marriage and this house and this place. And it was really interesting for me at this time because I had always been transient. All through my childhood, all through my 20s, I was and early 30s. And I would go to someone like Keith Carter's lectures, and he would talk about being from a place. I was like, I want to be from a place, I was never from a place. And this idea that being from a place could change the way you made pictures was extraordinary to me. And so I decided I picked my place. And that place was going to be Maine. And so it was this idea of putting down roots and these sort of this bowl of cherries as being this metaphor for sort of stamping through life. This is Doug. This is where we see Doug appear. So it started to be that I constructed less and found more. And I'm really interested in that sort of divide between constructing and finding. And so the event actually had to be happening for me to make a picture. I couldn't sort of construct the whole thing. I still tweaked, I still moved, orchestrated. I still concerned about the edges, but I really tried to find more. And this is Doug, and these are not his underpants. Everyone thinks they are. That's a napkin. Just a little joke there. And so about being from this home, and it was only afterwards at a lecture someone was saying how, this spells we, but. And so I just made work. And there's a sweetness to some of these pictures. I don't believe that art has to be good or bad or happy or sad. It has to be felt by you, the maker. Again, it comes back to the pencils, like what are you trying to say? And I was trying to say that this is happy for me. I'm photographing this sort of sweetness of this newly married life together. And it was interesting. I lived in Boston. I taught at the Art Institute of Boston at Lesley University for 8 years. I loved teaching. It was the hardest decision of my life to give up that job. But I didn't want to go back and forth anymore. And I realized, and I'm going to sort of challenge you guys, I realized that I made, in the 8 years that I lived in Boston, I made one picture I liked. I would literally race to Maine every single weekend. And as soon as I got there, I just, it didn't matter what time of day it was, I was out. I was like smelling the air and making pictures. I just could not make pictures in the city. And I love the city. I love coming to New York. I was like the country mouse in the city today when I got off the plane. But it's not right for my pictures. So what's right for you guys? Figure that out. Where do you need to be from? Where do you need to live? I'm not suggesting anyone leave SVA, but I'm saying, know where you make work, know what is right for you, and head there as much as possible. Because literally one picture in 8 years in Boston, and this is it. And it's of something rural, this tiny little garden. So that, and it took me only, until last year to figure out that, this Rolodex of landscapes that I have in my head in Maine is so important, such an important part of my process. And it's not to say that there wasn't sort of hard times, you know. I mean, I'm a romantic, but it wasn't that I just sort of skipped along with a picnic basket, you know, through my days. Doug's father, I made this picture when we planted a memorial tree for Doug's father. He was 62, young, and in June, Father's Day, June 10th, I think in the States, he was like, oh, got a bit of a bad back. He died 2 months later, less than 2 months later, on his birthday, August 4th, of pancreatic cancer. It moved through him like wildfire. And he was someone who wore, you know, spandex every day, went biking, you know, we'd laugh at him, it was pink spandex, you know, and he just was larger than life character. And have this happen was just sort of extraordinary. And all Doug could do at the time was paint his house, or paint our house. And you know, it kept peeling and peeling and peeling, and it was this summer in Maine, I think it was 2009, and it rained and it rained and it rained and it rained. I think it was the summer you were up there, Frances. And it rained every day for 45 days, and all Doug could do is peel paint in the rain, and all I could do was make pictures and cook stews. And it really interesting. I do think that cooking stews, not baking. Baking is too precise, but cooking stews is somehow related to picture making. There's something about like the chopping and the think time, thinking about, oh, what do I need? I need a carrot or whatever, you know, thinking about that. And then the long cook time. I'm not interested in anything that cooks in less than an hour. I like a good 4-hour cook time where, you know, I think smelling and you're thinking about things and you're sort of going back. That's almost like the darkroom time. And then you have the sort of final product where you're like, is that any good? You know, a bit more salt maybe. So I think that, you know, cooking and picture making, again, was sort of this way to process this really difficult time. This is called the unsent letter. You know, thinking about that lag time, you know, with film and digital. Around this time I switched to digital, and again, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how free I could be digitally. And I was someone who I photographed using a film called 100 speed Reala, and I overexposed it. So literally my photographs and the sets were, you know, 4-second exposures and 30-second exposures, and these really long, everyone thinks of sort of fashion shoots as being, you know, this sort of fast set. Mine was like, everyone be quiet, tip it so around like this, you know, so we can have these long exposures. So moving to digital, I loved it. You know, it took me a while. I was probably the last one in the gate, and I raced through it. And I started making pictures in the rain. I started making pictures at night. I could change my ISO. It was this, you know, freeing thing to just, you know, it didn't matter what camera I was using. It didn't matter if it was film or digital. It was just a matter of making something. So use the camera that makes you want to make something the most, I say. This is Scarlet in the Snow. So, you know, I stopped being precious with my cameras, you know, and if I broke one on the way in the line of duty, well, that was fine. So I broke a lot of cameras around this time. You know, I really photographed in driving rain. I figured, hey, people in Scotland make pictures. I'm going to take my camera out in the rain, in the snow. I'm going to photograph underwater without the housing, and just, you know, I'd sort of let go of the constraints of what that 100-speed Reala had given me. And then this happened. It was a completely unplanned photograph. I think it's probably one of my strongest photographs. I like them all for different reasons, what they bought. But this, I was actually sort of facing this way and working on a set for a book cover. I shoot a lot of book covers. And I turned around and I saw this. This is Emmy, a neighbor, waiting in her dad's truck for the shoot to be done. And I realized at the time that it was this gift given. I think I took 2 frames. You know, she's got her foot on the brake lights here in this one. And then I realized I could never have planned this in 1,000 years. So this idea, again, of just sort of letting go and just responding to the world, and how it is, again, to just sort of drive around and see what can be found. And then I started more recently, adding sort of this video element to the photograph. And I think why I'm doing this is because I want my pictures to sort of pick you up and drop you off somewhere slightly different. You know, I think of it almost like a, you know, in the best, you know, this is what I aim for. I'm not saying they all do this, but in the best of cases, they become this sort of novel that after you've finished it and closed it, you're a little bit different afterwards. And so that's what I'm after in these pictures. And I think with the animation part, it does just jolt you a bit more further because it starts playing with our perspective on time. That's what I think I'm doing with those. So I started with with making that picture of Emmy. I then started working in sort of the community, my friends, neighbors, people I didn't know very well, but I knew of. And I started to see, I was looking for sort of something that surprised me. And I'm interested in the idea of the portrait. What's universal in the portrait? Why is you know, Mona Lisa universal and someone else isn't? You know, what is it, you know, that look of when it's your kid, but that it somehow transcends and becomes about all kids? That's what I'm interested in. And I don't have any of the answers. I think, you know, earlier on in my career, I sort of strove to sort of figure out the answers, and now I'm enjoying being puzzled by a photograph that I didn't expect to make is what I'm interested in, a look that I didn't expect to make. I think of like a gaze as almost being this sort of platform, that all the landscape, the interior is almost just this stage for the portrait to sort of play out. Beyond this sort of one moment. This is Emmy again. When I made this picture, she had just finished telling me that she was being bullied at school. So I duct taped rhubarb leaves onto her arms, and she flew around the garden. And she now is 15 and wants to be a photographer, and that makes me feel happy. I spoke to her the other day. Photography has become an escape for her too, and I think that I'm proud of that time. This is Anne-Marie and Moose. She actually does look like her dog. You see that happening quite often. This is I was going to talk a little bit about the writing. I've always written, you know, from these sort of long accordions. I do this sort of mind map thing with my students where I force them to write for 20 minutes straight, and that basically gets out everything that's inside. And then we find a way to make that visual. And we make these sort of these mind maps where they're sort of thinking about nouns and verbs and adjectives that somehow can make visual what we're feeling inside. And so I've always written, and I never thought I would publish my writing. That was not the writing was just a way to get access to the pictures, right? But then when it came to publishing, you look at me like an emergency. I started realizing that that the words brought something to the images that the images didn't do. And there was a directness with the words that the images were somehow shrouded with beauty or color. And so what grew out of that, I was writing around this time that I made this image of my assistant Claire in the Forsythia, was the Boston bombings had just happened, and men in Yemen were being hung from bridges. And what came out in the pictures was just pure escapism. It was like crawl in the Forsythia. Because Forsythia, I don't know if you know this, but it's completely empty inside. They're tents. So Forsythia is just a tent waiting for you to climb in, and I urge you all next spring to do that. In Maine, there's every driveway have these Forsythia, and I actually met Francis's aunt in there for a cup of tea this year, and now I have my Forsythia club, where if your world is just getting too much, call in the Forsythia, and you won't believe it. It's so yellow. Your eyes, you just come out and you see yellow for days. It's like this sunshine-stained eyes. And so again, this photography, sort of, the words were saying one thing, but the pictures were doing the opposite. That sort of balance and mirror thing that I was talking about earlier. This is my niece, Sid. And this is Devon. I photographed Devon many times, sort of as a child, and now she's at Emerson. She's an actress. But there's something about her gaze. We work well together. there's something I don't understand. She always gives me something strange. And I knew that this landscape about a mile away from my house was something that I wanted. And I wanted to make a picture with fireflies for years and years. And I tried for years and years. And the fireflies, well, I left the exposure, the shutter open too long and they were just gone. Or they was too quick and they were just like little tiny, they looked like buttercups. It's like not what I wanted. So I knew that this landscape called Beach Hill, it's high up, and it sort of looks over the Penobscot Bay. I knew that there was a picture there. So it was just finding the right time. I did bring the bird house with me. I didn't tell Devon what to wear, but I knew that if we went up there at dusk that something might happen. But I'd been up there many times at dusk and it wasn't the right night, the winds weren't right, the fireflies are fussy, you know, so it's this idea that a picture can haunt us and we have to go back and keep waiting and keep waiting for that one image that I love, that sort of keeps me anxious. And then this happened. I got pregnant. I didn't. This isn't me. This is I used this as a surrogate. It's my friend Elizabeth, and I made this picture. Sort of not knowing what would happen next with my picture making. I didn't know. I didn't know if I was, you know, ending up putting babies in pots, which I did do. It's kind of fun in a crusade, but I didn't know. I just sort of went with it. And I was talking to a friend of mine today. During the time that I was pregnant, I actually didn't make pictures. It was almost like the creative energy I needed to make a person went to, those ingredients went to making making a person and not pictures. It wasn't a creative time for me. It was very inward. But then when I had Scout, the pictures sort of came roaring out of me, and I made pictures at night. And it was the first time I'd really made pictures at night. And I think it was because I was up at night for the first time, all night. And I would sort of, you know, blindly go and make pictures. And it wasn't that people would say, were you mind mapping? Were you brainstorming during this time? And I was like, no, I was lucky if I had pants on, you know, outside. But I just trusted this process. I knew that photography would give me something if I just could get the energy together, even though I was exhausted, to go and make pictures. And I didn't plan stuff, I just responded. And again, it's that tricky little thing that no other medium has to deal with, is subject matter. And what chose to come out in the pictures was sort of extraordinary. I saw, you know, while my kitchen table, you know, when I was not a mother, it was full of magical fiction novels. You know, 100 Years of Solitude and Aaron Jetta Roy, just all these great novels. And then when I had a baby, it became like full of manuals. What to expect the first year, how to plant an ever-blooming garden, I don't know, how to cook something. And so my life became all these manuals. But what happened in the pictures was that they became about instinct and nurture and wonder and fear. You know, I used, without realizing it, I started photographing animals and the seasons and things changing. And it became this sort of reference of time and something that was sort of perhaps unknowable. But most of all, I sort of saw this, when I was looking at that, I think we spent all this time making pictures and not enough time really looking at what we've made and why we've made it. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing. Like, that's what I love in the teaching part. It's like, why did you make that? Why are you so fascinated with that person? Or, you know, these cameras are extraordinary things, right? Because they give us access into people's lives. If you didn't have a camera, you know, that documentary project that you're doing, you would just be some weird guy staring. These cameras legitimize our inquiries into life, right? And so for me, it was so interesting to see that this fear that was coming out. I broke my camera during this particular shoot. Who knew pomegranate seeds were so sticky? It jammed, but I don't care because I made this picture, which I really love. And people say, well, do you tell Scout to sort of sit there and organize her? I'm like, no, do you know a 2-year-old like that? That she does whatever she wants. And that's been really good for me because I just have to be quicker and also respond more and there's no redos. And I sort of like that. I always felt like, this is Devon again, she was sort of tapping out Morse code, or something I didn't realize. My friend Alyssa. 7. So these pictures, you know, from gardening at night, the writing is much more about the sort of outside world and what's happening in the outside world, and then the pictures are really inward and instinctual, about family and home and nature. I went to St. Petersburg and made a picture that looked like it was made in Maine. It's my goal always. No, kidding. I'm off to Cuba next week, so let's see if I could slot a Cuba into my Maine pictures. But look at this, the world's amazing. And I think, you know, again, I'm too lazy to get up unless at dawn at 4 a.m. unless I have a camera in my hand. You know, photography puts me in a field of fireflies at dusk. It puts me, you know, it gets me up to make pictures at daybreak. I just wouldn't do it without. So these cameras, they're an amazing tool as a way to sort of make you appreciate the world more, I think. I didn't mean to make Doug look like he was holding an AK-47. The camera did. And again, you know, this idea that we see things afterwards if we really look. And then if we spend time with the pictures that don't work as much as the ones that do, I think that's sort of my favorite thing to do, is analyze, you know, what happened, analyze the reject pile. And, you know, and I love that. I didn't see that that's what the camera does. It transforms things. It sees things very differently than our eyes. This is my father. And I'm going to just move through these last few pictures. This is Sadie again, who I photographed in the yellow Cadillac. I really like photographing the same people over a long period of years. Scout. You know, this one I might have, you know, sometimes I need a, you know, an opinion on, like, I got my mommy goggles on, you know, is it a cute kid picture? You know, you have to, like, work out, you know, these different crosses to bear. This might fall into that, but that's all right. I'm allowed one. This is my friend Kendall. And he said, so these are from the last couple months. So I've less to say about them because I just made them, you know, and I like that. It's like I haven't sat with them long enough. This is a good one to share for all you makers of things. You know, I made this in this and the next one. I haven't quite decided which one I like better. I made them both, obviously. This March, and I was struggling. I was really, you know, struggling. I had nothing to say, and I hadn't made a picture in a while, and I was, you know, felt like I was repeating myself, and I was driving around Warren, Maine, just driving, waiting for something amazing to happen. It was like, I don't know what I expected to see, like stampeding herds of wildebeest, but it was just, you know, sometimes I think we have the best job in the world, but we also have a really hard job, and I just was, you know, couldn't find anything, and then literally this sort of cormorant bird, which I didn't know at the time it was a cormorant, sort of fell from the sky and died. And I sort of, as a sign, I picked it up, put it in the backseat of the car, and photographed her for couple of days and then sent her down the river. But Scout came in, I was photographing, I was sort of making this still life in my studio, and I was standing on the table, and she came in and she sort of did this amazing gesture of empathy. And then she had a, like, I don't know, a Dora plaster or something on her finger, and she took it off her finger and then put it on the wing, and then turned around and walked away. And I couldn't believe the compassion for a 2-year-old that she did that, and it moved me to tears, this moment. And so that's why I probably can't separate which picture I think is stronger, but that again, you know, photography gave that to me as a gift. And I asked her to do it again, and she was like, nope, bye-bye, gone. You know. This is Scarlet and the poppies. So, you know, I think that this work is darker, you know, thinking about my earlier black on white work, the sort of cleanness of it all, the sterile quality of it, you know, was made at a time where there was such darkness in my life, but it became this escape. And then now that, you know, I think this newer work, it's physically darker, but also sort of content-wise. This is my mother. Cammy. There's something about her look that I really like. I'm not sure this one will withstand the test of time too, but there's something about, I think it's, you know, Girl with a Pearl Earring, or something about her gesture that I'm interested in here. So, you know, an image will stay with me for a couple of months, and again, it's that lag time of film and digital. I try and do the same thing, whereas, you know, if I'm shooting digital, I really try and wait a few days before I process the film, you know, and then I go back to it every day for a couple of weeks, rather than sort of, you know, ripping through it. I try and treat it like it's film. Do you remember the days when you would process film, you know, those big canisters, and even if you, like, you know, that you loaded the film wrong, you would never chuck that film away. You would, like, cut up your Hasselblad sleeves and sleeve the empty, there was nothing on it, but you still wouldn't throw it away. So I try and treat my digital files with that same process and that same time. I don't love sitting in front of a computer. You know, in fact, I did the stupid thing where I made in my studio, I made the computer part really uncomfortable. So now I'm just sat there like this. But I did it because I wanted to be over here at the table making things with my hands, and not stuck at a computer. I see the digital darkroom absolutely as something that, you know, just a tool. Like, I'm really interested in the real world. I'm interested in, I love, you know, highly Photoshop work, but it's just not for me. Like, my job I see in life is to find it in the real world, and then I'll dodge and burn and color shift, but you know, I'm not going to change anything that wasn't actually there. And that's it. That's the last one. Thank you.
I have 2 questions. First one, I saw your picture is very quiet and very personal. I can see a very quiet place. But through my observing, I thought you probably a kind of anxiety person, so it's kind of conflict to each other. So I want to know why. And the second question is, all of your photos is presented by square frame, and I wonder if I was wondering, have you ever have some picture is more beautiful to present as a regular frame? Yeah, and or you just want to force it to square to fit in this series?
Yeah, I think that we'll start with the second question, the second comment first. You know, I worked rectangle for years and years and years, and then I sort of picked up a Hasselblad in the 90s and felt like, oh, I had this red slippers on or something. I loved the sound of it. I loved the feel of it in my hands, and it shoots square. So, you know, I don't think square or rectangle, I don't think one is more difficult than the other. It's just the way you see. And I felt like that was the way I see. And so when I switched to a different camera that didn't shoot square, I just always saw that way and just took it out in post. And I also shoot with a little Fuji, and that I can actually program to shoot square. So I think it's just the way I see. I think I probably made 1 or 2 images in years and years of making where I think that's better as a rectangle. But, you know, I figure, well, tough. You know, I like the discipline. I always like the discipline of photography. I like the fact there's only so many f-stops and so many shutter speed. I mean, our tools are about this big in the scheme of things. Like, aperture, shutter, frame, you know, so if you didn't get it, then you didn't get it. So I feel like if I've messed up a few pictures because I haven't used them because they weren't good square, then that's all right. The first comment, I actually feel like I'm not nervous at all. I mean, I've got a couple of mates here in the audience that I think they would agree that I'm fairly normal. I like to laugh. You know, I just feel like photography is a place where I can sort of, we all need a channel, right, to put our thoughts in. And for me, that's photography. And I might be exploring something. You know, I've also made lots of happy pictures. You know, I think the impulse to write poetry is more pronounced when you've been dumped, you know. But I don't think it's always, you know. So I'd like to think that I have a balance in that. But, you know, I think it actually keeps me more balanced. I think people that don't have a channel, they're, you know, the ones you need to watch out for, maybe.
As you said, that photography is very cathartic for you, and it's very sort of personal, and the work that you show is very personal. My question is actually to do with the people that you include in your photos and the themes that you decide to discuss about your life. How do you feel, do you ever get worried about your relationships with these people and how your work will affect your relationship with them in terms of like the commentary you're making upon them through the photograph? Or
are you saying that they're more self-portraits rather than portraits?
No, like for example, like including your husband and including your children and including your neighbors and so on. And these people are very personal to you, obviously. And in a way, you're kind of making a comment about them as well.
Right. I mean, I think it's a really, I love all that stuff. I love thinking about that stuff. I think that, you know, I always go into any kind of shoot saying, I'm thinking about this. I think the pictures are much more to do with me than they are about them, you know, and we talk about that. And, you know, no one is ever forced to be in a picture, of course not, you know. So I think that I think that photography is so slippery with that idea of when is it about the maker and when is it a portrait of the person, you know, and it's a conversation that I'm always wanting to have.
Just to follow up on
that,
you say that the camera always shows you something different from what you see.
Yeah, most of the time.
And it's because your work is very personal. Are you sometimes afraid of what the camera will show you about yourself?
You know, I've definitely have that. That's a great question. I've definitely had that in the past where a picture I've made, I thought it was about one thing and it clearly was about something else, but it took me months or someone else to say, and it's left me in tears, and I've seen that happen to lots of my students. But I also think that's kind of great. You know, I feel like being an artist is about turning yourself inside out. That's the only way to make authentic work. You know, you can't make polite work or, you know, or work that is you know, censored in a sense. So I think that you know, I think those questions that you're asking, I think they're wonderful things to debate afterwards and really hard to debate. You'd almost stop yourself making if you thought too hard about it all beforehand. But I really love all of those thoughts. I just don't know the answers to them. But I think that's why photography is so slippery and so amazing.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk so far. The question goes a bit in the same direction as Taya's question just before. If you do a shoot, you know, you say at times you're surprised by what happens afterwards. Yeah. I'm wondering how much of a visual concept do you have prior to taking the shoot? You know, what is your sort of determination to do this and that shot, or do most of your shoots just so happen and you're you know, it's times it sounds like you're surprised. You just take your camera, you're surprised what happens, but I can't really imagine that this being the case. So,
well, it has happened. I would say, you know, luck favors the prepared. So I definitely, you know, I mean, I'll turn up somewhere. I know that the light, you know, it's more about light. I'm always prepared with light. Like I know that at dusk I'm going to get something I want. I know at noon it's unlikely that you know, light is our biggest tool, right? So I'm definitely prepared in that sense, and I'll have sometimes some props, but I also find a lot of images too. So I feel like I do both now. Sometimes if I'm not finding things, then I'm going to say, all right, Devon, meet me here at this location at dusk. Let's see what we can get. And she'll bring something to the table. I'll be surprised. Sometimes it's nothing. I don't get anything. I certainly don't feel like I get something from every shoot. Far from it. You know. So I think I really try and just respond to the world. But when nothing's happening, I'll sort of go in with a plan. But I rarely like the pictures I think I'm going to make.
When I see the places you took photos, it looks really theatrical and staged, but at the same time it's really personal. So I just wonder like whether you choose to live in those places like with like looks really staged, or you manipulate or like replace all the things when you.
No, I mean, I think I'm drawn to certain places because they have a sort of magical quality to them, and the light that I choose has that. So I think that I definitely they're on my sort of list of places that I'm interested in for a long time for a reason. But I think it's more the light. I think when I was working in film, people would say, "Oh, what film do you use so that the color to get the colors?" And it was really just working with a particular light in a particular landscape.
Hi. I was wondering what inspired you to add the element of time, and was that done in post?
Yeah, it's a stream of video.
I was wondering what inspired you to add the element of time, and was that done in post?
I think photography is all about time, but that way of sort of extending time and slowing it down and speeding it up, and that's something I'm really in right now, so I might not have the perfect answer for you, but it was a way to sort of disrupt me in looking at the work. It was done in post. It's a line of video. I will record. I'll make a still, and then also run video afterwards and put them together in post. I have used effects, and they felt gimmicky. So with the animations, I'm really they're new, I'm struggling with them, I sort of like that struggle. When do they work? When are they gimmicky? I don't know necessarily, but I know that there's something there that I'm really interested in. They also exist outside of the web, they exist as pieces. I sourced screens and computers and they play on a loop, and they're meant to live in at home, and I've lived with them in my studio for a few years, and there's something really sort of mesmerizing about them when they work. But I tried using video with like Devon and her blinking. It just looked really, really corny. So when they fail really abysmally and loudly. So, yeah.
Really early on, you mentioned that you had chosen Maine as the place where you would be from. Yeah. And has that worked out in retrospect? Are you becoming more of a Mainer with each passing year?
Yeah, I love the living in Maine. I love the landscape. I love the I love the people there. I feel like it's absolutely going to be my home, my base for forever. I think it's been great to sort of have the sort of, again, like the construct of frame and shutter speeds of photography, just that I'm from this place, and then finding a way to photograph it anew. I try and keep everything simple in terms of not switching lenses or cameras to make the portfolio different, not switching places. I'm interested now in sort of what can be made by living in one place over a period of years and years and years. And I want to be, we picked the best medium, right? I mean, photographers are making, their work just gets better with age. At 90, they're still making, So I'm curious to see what happens, photographing this landscape over, 60 years.
Hi, again, thanks for being here. We often hear from other people that the best portraits of people are the ones where they're unaware of the camera. Yeah. But then we also hear on the other side that the person being photographed should have the right to choose how to be represented to the world. You tend to take a lot of candid or photos of people where they're unaware. What's your take on that?
I think you could have arguments for both, I think I can think of examples of wonderful pictures in the history of the medium where they're confronting the camera, and others where they're found, favorites in both categories. So I don't really know what is the formula there. I always try and make pictures where someone is sort of confronting the camera. They don't always work, but I always try. I am interested in that exchange. extraordinary revelation for me. And so I started telling my own stories rather than other people's. And I do think one day I'll go back to Potosi and make better pictures of those street kids and get that work published. I feel that's my duty, but right now I'm telling a more sort of simpler, localer story. So I moved to Maine, and I was torn between a couple of different programs. I was living in Bermuda in '99, and I was working for a platinum printer, and I was running his studio. His name's Mark Emerson. He was a wonderful guy, and he was sort of at the stage where he was about to retire. So my internship, studio managing, involved 3-hour-long lunches where he would sort of philosophize about the world, and I have so much love for him in my heart. It was great. It was a great time, and we talked about the power of pictures. And I moved to Maine, and I decided that instead of sort of running around like the headless chicken around the world, I would force myself to make pictures in one room for a year. And pretty much that's what I did. And what I would work in these long accordion journals, and I have a few examples with me tonight, where I would sort of brainstorm and think, okay, so this is pictures about things. I'm going to make work about what I think I'm going through. So I would sit down and I would write metaphors and symbols and as many different content things I could think of. Nouns. Photography is so tied to things, right? What we put our cameras in front of. And then also content. I mean, I truly believe that for a photograph to be strong, it needs to have both form, so light and the formal concerns, framing, camera, coming together with content, the story. So for a strong photograph, we have form and content coming together. So I would brainstorm all these different ideas. I would put it all in these accordion journals, and it was really just a place to begin. So that when Saturday morning came around, I would put the coffee on and I would get to work. I would say, okay, I'm trying to talk about my past. I'm going to start with a flower as a metaphor for myself. I'm going to talk about, it being closed, a closed soul where I had nothing to give. I'm going to talk about this sterile environment, but that door behind it being slightly ajar. So these pictures were highly sort of orchestrated. What I was trying to tell at the time, I thought these pictures so much were about nostalgia. I thought they were about my past, but what I really see now in retrospect, that they were everything to do with fantasy. I started making this work when I had been living with a guy for 8 years, and the last 2 of them he was also living with someone else, unbeknownst to me. And so when I moved to Maine, I used photography as a way to start talking about ownership back of my house. And so this idea that the house would come to me. And, and this idea that I had also been always from the school of yeah, but I couldn't, I couldn't get back further enough. Oh, yeah, but, he needed to leave. Yeah, but it was raining. Yeah, but my camera broke. And so this idea of sort of taking full responsibility for everything in the frame and for slowly, starting with a blank palette, sort of thinking myself more as a painter and adding the content in was a really good way for me to work. It's not the way I work now, but it's how I worked in '99. And also this idea of this sort of solitary making. It was exactly what I needed. It was my way of repairing. I literally, for a year, all I did was eat, sleep, and breathe photography. I slept amongst books. I woke up. I didn't go out once. I'd gone from being a very social person, I like to laugh, to someone who was just really inward and just making these pictures. So this picture is about being on the edge, being close. It's about scale. It's about significance. This was about my bitten down nails and hope. And initially, when I started making this work, I was sort of using subject matter that was classically beautiful, like vessels and beds. And then what I started to do was to try and sort of poke myself. I always ask myself, am I making brave art? Typically, the answer is no, but I'm trying. And I started adding objects into the pictures that had meaning to me. So this was the last time, I wore this dress the last time I saw him, and I ruined it at 3 a.m. by dropping cheeseburger down it. And it was a very expensive dress. And it, for me, became this symbol of this idea of the way I didn't want to be again. So I started putting clues into my pictures, and this asking yourselves, I think everyone in here is a maker, I imagine, and asking yourselves, who are your images for? Who are they made for? If someone had asked me at this time, I would have said, well, myself. But really, I was making work for someone who would never ever see it, and that's what this picture was about. And I would brainstorm in these books again and writing down my dreams and ideas. I would search out landscapes that that looked how I felt inside. I would fill up rooms full of leaves, talking about living in an underworld, which is how it felt at that time. So literally I lived in Maine, so good job I lived in Maine rather than New York. And I think I filled those enormous trash bags, 10 of them up, and a room this size, and it literally was waist height with leaves. The picture that I ended up liking was this one, where there are like 3 in my hair, and it took me, I think, a year later I was having classes in that room, and I'd still see leaves, over by where Katrina's, and so the point being, all this planning, all this foresight, all this sort of idea mapping was really just so I had a place to start. So that, but I really want to extend a huge thank you to SVA. It's my first time here, and I always wanted to go to school here, so maybe I'll come back and do another master's. Okay, so...
We have an online program too.
Oh! I like the surveillance thing. Maybe that's where I'm going to go. So that we're a wonderful group here. I'm completely wide open book in a lecture series like this. So ask me anything. I'll tell you everything. It's great to see some past students in the crowd. I know I got a couple of you there I can always smile at. So my journey with photography began when I was 13. I used to make tons of tea in a darkroom in the southwest of England. And my passion was documentary photography. I loved it. And when I was 16, I went to South America on my own, and I photographed the street kids of Potosi. And I came back armed with lots of mediocre film, and nothing got published. And the weight of that caused me to stop making pictures for a while. I knew that I loved photography, but I couldn't find my way in it. And it took me really until 1999 when I came to a school situation like this, and I sat in the front row, and I was first in and I was last out, and I was like, that's it. I finally found my voice and how to speak through photography, and it was because I started making pictures about things rather than of things. And that for me is sort of the biggest thing I want to share. Like, the lecture's done now, we can all go home. This idea that photography is storytelling about a subject matter. Before that, I had come from the school of, and the school, that's pretty, oh, look at that. It was like my photography was sort of target practice. And I was responding to just things in front of me. And the idea that it could not be that way, and I could sort of dig deep and tell things about the past, about my own experience, was an
Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have photographer Cig Harvey as tonight's guest speaker. Cig received her MFA from Rockport College and went on to teach for 8 years as assistant professor at Lesley University. Her photographs and artist books have been widely exhibited and are included in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Farnsworth Art Museum, and the George Eastman House, New York. Cig was recently nominated for the John Goodman Fellowship and was a finalist for the BMW Prize at Paris Photo, as well as a finalist for the Prix Virginia. In 2012, she had a solo show at the Stenersen Museum in Norway, in conjunction with the release of her monograph, You Look at Me Like an Emergency, from Schilt Publishing. Her second book, Gardening at Night, will be released in the spring of 2015, also from Schilt. Cig's devotion to visual storytelling has led to international campaigns and features with New York Magazine, Harper's Bazaar Japan, Kate Spade, and Bloomingdale's. On a personal note, I want to say, Cig, thank you for being here tonight. You braved an unseasonably heavy snowstorm in Maine, early November, unbelievable, but thank you for being here. So please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you for coming. I'm so honored to be invited. I always have to sort of pinch myself that this is actually my job. And I always get a little nervous before events like this because I just want to do a good job. I feel like we all picked the best medium, the most powerful medium in the world, and somehow I'm lucky enough to stand here right now. And so I just want to share with you just more about my process and how much I love this medium and what it's brought to my life. So I'm going to talk less about the pictures itself and more about my process, why I make, how I make.